So the early years of Oklahoma get its own lecture, primarily because it's really complicated. There are different groups coming together to form political alliances. There are different issues that come up during the time that get a lot of attention and debate. But here's the most important thing that you need to understand from a larger context perspective to help you better understand what's going on. And that is the issue of progressivism. So when you look at your history book, your American history book, if you're not familiar with it off the top of your head, what you need to do is look at the early 1900s. There should be a chapter in your U.S. history book that talks about specifically what the progressives are all about, who the progressives are, and what it is that they were fighting for. The progressives are a spin-off of the populist movement of the 1880s and the 1890s, but they are far more successful. They have better strategies, both politically and economically. And I think you can also make the argument that the progressive era is best personified by Theodore Roosevelt, who is in office when Oklahoma becomes a state. And so we'll spend some time talking about Theodore Roosevelt as well. So I want you to be familiar with, if not comfortable, then at least familiar with progressivism as we get into this particular lecture. So let's talk about this idea of statehood and what it takes to transition from territory into statehood. One of the things that you need to keep in mind here is what makes this particular story unique is that for Oklahoma, we're not just talking about shifting one territory into statehood status. We're talking about two territories, and that's different from everywhere else. And the other issue at hand here is we are talking about one particular territory being Indian territory. And Indian territory is rife with all sorts of issues of sovereignty, at least from Native perspective, right? From the federal perspective, there is no issue of sovereignty. That's all been dealt with thanks to the Curtis Act. If you remember from your notes and previous lectures, the Curtis Act of 1898 basically says you have no sovereignty anymore. We're basically taking all of that away. And slowly but surely, that's all been essentially eliminated through various different actions, right? But for Native peoples, they're trying to find different ways to hold on to sovereignty. They're finding different ways to hold on to their identity. And so the idea of being able to keep Indian territory is one of desperation. It's something that they are going to hold on to for as long as possible. And transitioning from Indian territory to statehood is one they are going to avoid. And that's something that I want you to remember. This whole idea of becoming a state is not something that Native people support. In fact, until 1903, the five Southeastern tribes and most other tribes in Indian Territory oppose statehood. They want nothing to do with it. And then the Curtis Act in 1898, one of the conditions of the Curtis Act basically says tribal governments as they are going to come to an end. And so it even gives an end date in the Curtis Act. It basically says by a specific date in 1906. And I believe you don't have to write this down, but I believe it says March of 1906 or something like that. But it gives an exact date in 1906. But that's how cruel the Curtis Act is, because it says in 1906 there is no tribal government. It is what it is. It's over. And after the Curtis Act, what these tribes realize is, oh, wait a second, you guys have set a clock. And as the years go by and as they get closer and closer to 1906, they realize, oh, hang on a second. This means that our time is coming close. And if that's the case, then we better figure something out. And so what they decide to do is they propose that maybe instead of unifying both territories into one gigantic state, why not have a state of our own? Why not propose two states and our state having our own um, convention? And that's where the Sequoia Convention comes in. So the Sequoia Convention was hosted in August of 1905. To be exact, it's August 21st, 1905 is when it begins. And it's hosted in Creek Nation, Muskogee Creek Nation. And it's instigated by a Cherokee citizen who basically says, listen, time is coming close, and it's very close. So this is August of 1905. Remember, tribal governments will come to an end in early spring 1906, right? So essentially, the argument here is let's put together a convention, and at this convention we will write our own constitution, and at with this constitution we'll submit it to Congress, and let's hope that they will grant us statehood, right? um Here are some things that you should know about this convention. With every single constitutional convention, there are delegates, right? There are a couple of notable convention delegates that I want to mention here. One is a guy named Charles Haskell, and another is a guy named William H. Murray. Charles Haskell, both of these men, by the way, are white. They are not Indian. Um, Charles Haskell and William H. Murray are both going to be Oklahoma governors. Charles Haskell will be the first Oklahoma governor. William H. Murray married into the Chickasaw tribe, and Charles Haskell will serve as the vice chair of the Sequoia Convention. William H. Murray will serve as the representative of the Chickasaw tribe, even though he only married into it. But by marrying into it, he was able to gain access to and therefore rights to all of the Chickasaw properties and resources and that sort of thing. Lucky for him. So both of these names will come up later in this lecture. So just keep that in mind. So in your notes, put little asterisks by them because they are worth noting. So when we talk about this particular convention in Indian Territory, it is dominated by, politically speaking, men who identify as Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats. These are going to be people who are very democratic in nature, and that's going to be a problem when they submit their constitution to the U.S. Congress. Now, their constitution is 35,000 words long. It includes the name that they have given to their proposed state. The name that that they come up with is Sequoia. It gets to Congress, and Congress at that time is dominated by Republicans. And not only is Congress dominated by Republicans, the country is led by a very Republican president by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, here's the thing. All of these Democrats in Indian Territory, not all of them, but a vast majority of them, including Haskell, including William H. Murray, will identify themselves as progressives, as will a majority of the Republicans in Congress, and most of all, Theodore Roosevelt. So progressive is a label. It is not a party. At this point, it is a label. It is not a party. Eventually, there will be a party that will be a progressive party. But At this point, it is very much a label that anybody can identify with, right? You can be a progressive Democrat, you can be a progressive Republican, and it doesn't matter. So there are a lot of Republicans and Democrats alike who identify themselves as progressive, um, and it's fine. It works for both party members, and in fact, it's very sort of in vogue to be progressive. But how you are progressive and what you identify yourself as being progressive with is really going to distinguish um, distinguish you from others, right? And that's something to keep in mind. Now, because they submit their constitution to a Republican Congress, their application is denied, and so they wait until they, meaning Congress, waits to see what comes next from Oklahoma. And when it's clear that Oklahoma territory is more Republican than its twin territory, um, Theodore Roosevelt feels more comfortable signing the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act of 1906 is passed and signed in, and basically says um, that the following things are allowed to push forward the statehood of Oklahoma. And here's the thing: when we talk about an enabling act, any enabling act, what Congress is essentially doing is basically setting the rules for how a territory will transition into a state, right? And so a territory will have to meet certain specific obligations on what it's going to have in its constitution. Like, for example, it will say things like you have to have freedom of religion. You have to, like for Oklahoma, there were things like they had to have freedom of religion. They could not allow for polygamy because evidently that was really important. Um, well, in light of what had happened with Utah, that was something that they wanted to make clear. That's a whole separate story. So there were specific rules that were listed. They had also listed, Congress had also set the capital of the territory in Guthrie, and that was specifically because it wanted to make clear that the capital needed to be in Oklahoma territory and nowhere in Indian territory. They wanted it to be in a place dominated by Republicans. They wanted it to be in a city dominated by Republicans. So, not just in Oklahoma territory because it was dominated by Republicans, they wanted the city dominated by Republicans. So, even the choice of Guthrie itself, it wasn't just because of population size or anything like that. It was also because of political motivation. So that's important as well. So everything has intention behind it. The Enabling Act also establishes statehood officially for November 16th, 1907. So essentially, the idea is okay, you guys are going to have delegates assemble for your constitutional convention, and you will have this many months to come together, to meet, to debate on what should be included in your constitution. And as a result, you've got to first of all vote on who you're sending to the constitutional convention. Then these delegates will debate on what's going to be included in the constitution. Then you're going to vote on the constitution, submit it to us. Not only that, but you are also going to vote for um, your state officers and representatives. Now, in the middle of all of that, here comes none other than William Jennings Bryan. Again, in order to be familiar with William Jennings Bryan, who is pictured here on the right, William Jennings Bryan is a national figure who is famous for a lot of reasons. He will serve as Secretary of State. He will serve as a congressman from Nebraska. He will also be someone who runs for president a couple of times, and someone who populists will get behind because they believe he is their voice for the populist movement. He doesn't believe that he can win for the populists, but they think he can, and that's in 1896. Instead, he fully embraces the progressive movement because the progressives are much more successful. And he becomes this sort of national voice who travels thither and yon, basically, campaigning everywhere and anywhere that he can, to talk about progressive values. And so on the bottom left, um, you'll see this image of a crowd gathering, and they're all there so they can listen to William Jennings Bryan speak at Alva, Oklahoma. This is just to listen to him talk about the great benefits of the state constitution. He comes to Oklahoma a couple of times. Once he comes before the Constitutional Convention, and he's coming before the convention primarily because he pressures the convention delegates to write what he believes should be the greatest constitution ever. That's what he argues. He said, if you don't write the best constitution ever, it will be entirely your fault. And that's not an exact quote, but that's pretty close. And I'm not exaggerating. That's actually really close to what he says. Um, and so the convention assembles, and here are the things that you need to know. Actually, before we get into the issue of race, here are the things that you need to know about the convention, the makeup of the convention itself. When we talk about it, in fact, let me see if I get into this at all. There we go. When we get into the convention itself, so going back to the previous issue, the issue of race is something that matters a lot, primarily because if you look at the makeup of the convention, it will actually make sense. So there are 112 delegates sent to the convention, and here's why: 55 delegates come from Oklahoma Territory, 55 delegates come from Indian Territory, and then 2 come from Osage Nation. The Osage Nation get 2 primarily because the Osage Nation were the first peoples, considered the first peoples there in Indian Territory, and therefore get 2 of their own representatives. So 55 from Indian Territory, 55 from uh, Indian Territory, Oklahoma Territory, and then 2 from the Osage, bringing it to a grand total of 112. Of the 112 delegates, 99 were Southern Democrats. 99. That means that only 12 were Republican and 1 was an independent. 1 person was an independent. So here's the thing. When we talk about this whole idea of having a constitutional convention dominated by not 1 being independent, 13 being independent. Um, when we talk about being dominated by one mindset or one agenda, this is a good example of that, right? Southern Democrats had essentially run the table here. A lot of that is because after the Civil War was over, remember, many refugees had come into this area, had come into Indian Territory, and essentially set up camp here. Um, this is where they settle. And so Oklahoma is, again, not a southern state, but people are going to come here and create their own livelihood here. And so while it's not a Southern state, they are going to set up their own culture and identity here. So 99 delegates are Southern Democrats, 12 are Republicans, and 13, not one, 13 are independents. Now, when we talk about independents, most of these people are going to identify as socialists. Most of them are going to identify as socialists. So keep that in mind. The chair of the Constitutional Convention is none other than Alfalfa Bill Murray, William Alfalfa Bill Murray, William H. Murray, who was the representative for the Chickasaws at the Sequoia Convention. That guy. He is um, someone that you should be mindful of. So Murray was born in Texas, spent quite a bit of time there, and he is a Southern Democrat through and through. He will move to Oklahoma, get married in the Chickasaw Nation. Mary's there to take advantage primarily of Chickasaw land resources so that he can essentially get rich, and which he does. He loses a lot of it, loses a lot of money, but ends up, uh, creating a political career for himself. Um, William Murray is president of the convention and chairs most of the sessions. And here's the thing about William Murray: he is loud and opinionated, and he is also someone who is very um, in your face about very Southern issues. And here's the thing about Texas: Texas isn't quite Southern either. It's more Southwest in its culture, in its environment, and that sort of thing. But it's also very clear on where guys like Murray stand on issues of race and gender. And Murray uses the issue of race quite a bit when it comes to some of the things that come up during this convention. So, when we talk about what happens um, during the convention, one of the topics that comes up very early on is this issue of where uh, Black uh, citizens and Black members of society, whether they lived among Native peoples or whether they were here as free peoples, um, where they belonged, right? Whether they were living in all Black towns, it didn't matter. Where do they belong? Where do they live? How are they living? Or how do they walk? How do they work among white peoples and white communities? And Murray wants to make it clear that there needs to be an establishment of a segregated policy. And he is going to be someone who sort of speaks up, and not only that, becomes a dominant voice on behalf of segregation. And as you can see on the screen here, these are newspaper articles that come out of the Daily Oklahoman, as it was known back then. And you'll notice on the far right, if I can get my pen out here, this image, this editorial image here that I want to point out, you'll notice that there are 3 Black children. And you'll notice in how these 3 Black children are portrayed, these images are exaggerated, right? These children are essentially portrayed as poor. Their feet are bare, and their faces are exaggerated, extremely exaggerated, and they're all through sort of looking at the boys, especially. So you have a little girl here, but the boys are both looking at this little girl, and you notice that this little girl, this white little girl, is looking like perfection. She is drawn to perfection. There is nothing exaggerated about her face, about her dress, about anything, right? It's the 3 Black children that are exaggerated. whether it's their skin tone, the shape of their head, their face, their features. All of that is exaggerated. But with the little white girl, she's drawn to perfection. That's important to notice those details. You have to ask yourself why. And I think we know the answers to that. But the other thing that I want to point out here is this. It's this question that the cartoonist asked at the top of the cartoon. Have you a daughter, Mr. Voter? Have you a daughter, Mr. Voter? It's the implication that the little girl is in danger by standing next to these two boys, right? That's the implication of the question. That by standing next to them, by these two little boys, that this little girl is in danger. And here's the thing. When we talk about the messaging here, this is consistent not just with what's going on here in the Daily Oklahoman. This is consistent from the very beginning, whether we're talking about slavery or Jim Crow or even present day, that it is the fragility of white womanhood and the vulnerability of white womanhood that we have to protect white women. And that's why there are all of these policies against Black people, right? That Black people are aggressive and therefore white women need to be protected or white children need to be protected. And that's why you have all of these policies, right? That's not at all true. There's nothing based in truth in that. There's nowhere that there's nothing in reality that supports that, but that's the overall message, right? You'll notice in the same image, this particular headline gives justice to both the races. In other words, this law would help both Black people and white people. So passing this is actually good for everybody. So treating Black Oklahomans as second-class citizens is actually to their benefit. It's protecting them as much as it is protecting white people. And you'll notice, and I'm not sure how well you can see this, but the sub headline is worth noting here too. It says, Negro must be made to know his place, should have equal privilege, but entirely separate. Now, how would that even be possible? Should have equal privilege, but entirely separate. Huh. Okay. And then, of course, there's this separate article here. Jim Crow law will be one of the first in the state of Oklahoma, right? So it's the first of many is essentially the implication. And of course it is. That's absolutely true. Issue of race is going to be the first of many. And the issue of race is going to be what's done to justify many things, including the issue of women's suffrage. And let me explain how. So the convention is taking place in Guthrie. And here's what a lot of people don't know about women's suffrage in Oklahoma. So prior to the convention, women were able to vote in school elections. And the reason why they was because for them it made sense. And again, this is a very progressive type of mentality. It made sense that women could vote for school elections because children were involved. And as women, no one would know the needs of children better than women. So women could vote in school board elections and things like that. During the convention, there was some sort of election taking place for the school board in Guthrie. And William Murray claimed that during a break for the convention, he went outside and saw a long line of women who were waiting to vote, and all of the women were Black. All of the women were Black. These were all Black women who were voting. And that was why we could not allow women to vote for other elections when they applied for statehood. In other words, it was hard enough to allow women to vote for school boards. And in fact, they almost took away that vote. They almost took away that right. Uh, it came incredibly close when he told the story of Black women voting for school board. The delegates nearly broke out in an angry riot. They were very angry and nearly took away all women's right to vote in the school board elections. And instead, they kept that, but then said, no, women should not be able to vote in anything more than that. And that's how race influenced the suffrage question there. So race plays a huge role in shaping the early years of Oklahoma. And it's really unfortunate because Oklahoma liked to play this um, idea or this whole reputation of being super progressive, right? And that's the thing. When it comes to these progressive reforms, uh, what the Constitution ends up looking like, uh, here's the thing, there are 33 rights listed in Oklahoma's Bill of Rights. 33 rights. And in terms of progressive reforms, Oklahoma is one of 4 states that will include progressive reforms such as initiative and referendum. And if you want to know what initiative and referendum are, make sure to look it up in your textbook, in your U.S. history textbook. But initiative and referendum are very progressive, and not every state has them. They are only in a handful of states. And the reason why they are only in a handful of states is initiative and referendum can be very expensive, and also they can be really annoying and bureaucratically problematic. Um, so it's very progressive. And the fact that in 1907 you have a place like Oklahoma pushing these very progressive, people-centered reforms is pretty impressive. William Jennings Bryan will return to Oklahoma after the Constitution is written and say this, that it is the best Constitution in the United States today. The best Constitution in the United States today. Here's the thing. It is 50,000 words long. It is 50,000 words long. And this is the thing. It was 50,000 words when it was written in 1907. It's even longer now. It's even longer now because it's been amended. So when we talk about the length of this Constitution, this thing is a monster. It has so much detail. We are talking about articles in this Constitution that address how businesses are supposed to run. Um, there's one article, I have this written somewhere in my notes just because of how hilarious it is, but it talks about how much propane should be in a tank, or how much light should be in a thing, because you wanted to make sure that only so much light could show. And they did it to protect consumers, but really? This is a problem. There's a lot of detail. And the thing is, there are a lot of people who believe, yes, this is an excellent constitution because it's designed to protect the people. So there are some people who indeed would agree with William Jennings Bryan and say, yes, the more detail, the better. However, there are others who would argue on the flip side that the more detail, the more problematic. And here's why. A constitution should be not this detailed. A constitution, if you want it to last long and if you want it um, to be able to withstand the changing times, it shouldn't be so detailed that you get lost in it and you get encumbered by it, right? There should be some elasticity in it. Elasticity meaning it should be able to breathe with how times change, right? You should be able to amend it without having to go through without being or worrying that it's impossible to amend it, right? That's the concern. So the Constitution is unique. Is it the greatest thing ever? It's unique. Okay. So let's talk about this process of becoming a state. So there's a whole ceremony designed to celebrate it, right? When we talk about the wedding and joining of the two territories, the whole purpose of the wedding of the two territories is really just a celebration and nothing more than that, right? The whole idea of Miss Indian Territory and Mr. Oklahoma Territory is really just the idea of putting together a ceremony of officially uniting the two territories the way that you would unite two individuals. And it really comes out of this whole question of how do we officially become one state out after having spent this much time being two different territories? How do you become one state, unify into becoming one economy, unify into creating one culture and one state identity? And the way they decided to do that is why not create this one moment where it would be a wedding? And in their minds, they thought this would be just this great historic moment where, everybody's doing weddings anyway, and you'll read about that in the book. But everybody's doing weddings anyway. We'll just go ahead and follow their lead. But the problem with this is that you know um, these two individuals don't necessarily represent the territories, especially Anna Bennett. Anna Bennett is barely barely identifies as a Native person, and by barely identifies, I mean she does not identify herself as a Native person. There's nothing about her um, in terms of her own cultural identity where she says, "Yes, I am definitely a Native person." Um, and yet she's the one who is chosen, and she is not up there during the ceremony wearing native dress. She's wearing the fashions of the day, he's wearing the fashions of the day, and they get married, and it's as simple as that. Of course it's a mock ceremony, there's nothing real about it, and it's not something that's widely um, respected when it comes to Native peoples. I mean, for Native peoples, this is yet another occasion that mocks their sovereignty, right? It dismisses their sovereignty and their identity. And then, of course, there's the location of the capital, right? So Guthrie is the capital, and that's fine, but it's temporarily the capital. Now, here's the thing: in the Enabling Act in 1906, um, Congress says, "Look, you guys have established a capital. We acknowledge that, and we agree that it will be the capital." until 1913. And then after that, you guys will have to vote and decide where you will establish your permanent capital, which is well and good. However, what ends up happening is long before that, there has been some conspiring going on, long before 1913. And so that's one of the things that you need to keep in mind. And it's still to this day, in the year of our Lord 2022, it is still a a deep-seated issue in the city of Guthrie, that the capital was stolen from them. And they have a legit argument. And they are right. They are right. The capital was stolen from them. So while the capital is technically Oklahoma City, it should be Guthrie because it was never put to a vote. According to Congress, according to the Enabling Act, it was supposed to be put to a vote. It was never put to a vote. It was stolen from the people of Guthrie. So I've made my voice clear. Let's just say that. Okay, let's talk about the politics of Oklahoma, and then we'll end with the good stuff. So when we talk about the politics of Oklahoma and why it's complicated, um, here's the thing. When Theodore Roosevelt and Congress approve of the, for lack of a better term, application for statehood, it's because they're convinced that Oklahoma Territory can pull it off and dominate it with their Republicans and win that way. And the problem is they underestimate local politics. The reason why the Democrats win is because Oklahoma, and that's looking at both Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory, that whole area is dominated by farmers and miners, right? And these farmers and miners are identifying, in terms of progressive policy, are identifying as either Democrats or socialists, right? And so you have a lot of these people who are trying to figure out who's best going to fight for me, who is best going to pull me out of the situation that I'm in. And here's the thing. If you are a farmer, you're in trouble because farming in Oklahoma is really difficult. And for those of you who have grown up on farms, you know that this is a place where it's not necessarily that easy to grow stuff out of the ground, especially considering that rain is not very predictable. Um, and you are in desperate need of rain. Furthermore, if you are a miner and you are living in Oklahoma in the 1880s and 1890s, or even long before that, you are living in one of the most dangerous places in the world. Certainly one of the certainly the most dangerous place in North America. There have been stories of mines where dozens of people die in one explosion, in one cave-in. It's not safe here, and these people are not protected. And so with Republicans, many of these farmers and miners feel abandoned. And what ends up happening is more often than not, they vote with the Democrats. That's how the Democrats win. With William Jennings Bryan, Bryan is a Democrat, and Bryan is going to campaign on behalf of Democrats. But so will local politicians who are much more charismatic in how they appeal to people. And progressives in Oklahoma are going to identify with these charismatic politicians. Now, Charles Haskell, who is pictured here, is not necessarily charismatic, but he is someone who knows how to follow a political trend. That's the thing. Charles Haskell is Charles Haskell is someone who knows how to hitch his wagon towards the more popular people in politics at the time when necessary. He will know how to create political alliances when necessary. He knows how to create um, the types of political alliances that will lead to his own benefit, I think is the way that I should put it. When we talk about guys like Charles Haskell, what you need to keep in mind here is that he wasn't necessarily guaranteed the win as Oklahoma governor. He had to wheel and deal for it. He had to be someone who really pushed for it, in the sense that he had to be someone who was willing to compromise quite a bit and say, "Okay, I'll be willing to do this if you throw support my way. I'll be willing to try this if you throw support my way." Um, so Haskell is um, someone who had long been interested in politics. He's, he's a guy who knows how to make connections early on. He'd lived in Muskogee since 1901, and worked with businessmen but what works in his favor is he knows how to make connections, right? So, um, when he moves to Muskogee in 1901, what he did is, um, he started to work with a bunch of different businessmen, and the town was super, super small when he first got there. And as he started working with these different businessmen, especially with the railroads, he connected them with each other. He started introducing one person to another and started making contacts, creating contacts among other contacts. By the time he was done, years later, Muskogee had grown into a city of 25,000 people. So this is a guy who knows how to make connections and knows how to create those alliances that I was talking about, right? So he ends up, getting into politics because obviously that's the natural transition for himself. He, you know, ends up becoming governor because of this sort of wheeling and dealing thing, but he doesn't know how to do that wheeling and dealing thing and connecting thing on the large scale that he's able to do one on one, right? As governor, you've got to do that on a larger scale. And he doesn't seem to know how to do that. He um, becomes governor of Oklahoma, and while he's governor, that's when he moves the state capital from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. And he does that on the sly. He doesn't do it, you know, he doesn't make the announcement and say, you know what, we're going to have a public election years early. Let's just go ahead and get this out of the way. He does it on the sly. And this is like in 1908. He basically makes wheels and he makes dealings with businessmen, and that's how he does it. He is someone who basically uses his connections with businessmen to um, like access, you know, better deals for himself. The economy doesn't do very well while he's in charge, and a lot of people essentially question his leadership, and challenge him quite a bit. They don't trust him, is really what it comes down to. And of course, why should they? I mean, there's nothing in his leadership where they can point to him and say, oh, yeah, this is a guy worth trusting, right? Here's the thing. He spends one term in office. And they think, yeah, we're good. He's not someone that they readily look to as a guy who is someone that they can rely on. And here's the thing: it's not entirely. I say all of this, and I'm about to now take it all back. It's not entirely his fault. First of all, um, the state itself is going through a lot of its own issues, right? The weather is not great, so farmers can't grow stuff. There's a huge problem. Farmers are going through its own their own problems in terms of economic issues. And here's the other thing. When we talk about this time period anyway, it's a brand new state. And when you've just unified two territories, there are going to be some early adjustments that have to be made. Now, add in Charles Haskell, and that doesn't help. Charles Haskell's not the guy you need at the helm in the early years of statehood. So there is also that. So Charles Haskell is not the leader that you need in the first years of statehood. So no, that does not help either. Um, but there's also this issue as well. The Democratic Party is really divided, and I'm talking about within the state. Um, Nationally, it's an issue too, but like within the state itself, it's very deeply divided. The Democrats are going through a lot of issues in terms of trying to figure out who they are and what they're dealing with. And quite frankly, they have no idea what it means to be a Democrat in Oklahoma. Who are we supposed to be, and what is it that we're supposed to be standing for? Right? This is the problem. What is it that we're supposed to be standing for? What is our first priority? What they knew during the convention is that their first priority is that they're going to be standing against integration and allowing Black people to do anything. They knew that. But other than that, they don't have a whole lot going for them. If that's the only thing that you have, well, then, okay, that's only going to take you so far. That's only going to take you so far. If your only issue is race, well, then, okay, that's the one issue that they can unify on. It is literally the one issue that they stand in agreement on is we know that we do not believe in equality, racial equality. That's the one thing they've got. But other than that, they don't have any agreement on how to go forward economically. They have no agreement on how to go forward socially or politically with both territories. Not a single idea. It's chaos for the Democrats. Now, there are overall, when you look at the progressives, whether they are Republican or Democrat, there are some progressives in leadership that I do want to talk about that are incredibly notable. One progressive Democrat that's of note is this woman here, and that's Kate Bernard. So Kate Bernard is, yes, a woman, and she is notable for several reasons. First of all, Kate Bernard has a very long, interesting career. So she was someone who was incredibly active prior to statehood. She moves into Oklahoma Territory when she's 16 years old, and she works as a teacher and absolutely hates it, and then becomes a secretary in the territorial legislature. And this person is basically super competitive at her job to the extent where she is like one of three territorial secretaries. And around 1904, there is the World's Fair in St. Louis. And the World's Fair is literally the World's Fair. There are representatives from around the world who come to St. Louis and put up booths and that sort of thing to talk about what their country has to offer, what their research has to offer, that sort of thing. And there is going to be at the World's Fair at St. Louis a booth about Oklahoma Territory. And so she wanted to man the booth for Oklahoma Territory. She wanted to be the territorial hostess. That would be the official title for her if she had gone. And so she starts literally, there's no other word for this. She starts annoying everyone and anyone that she could in the legislature to get this job. And she annoyed people so much that they said, just go. So that's where she goes. She goes to St. Louis. And from that point on, um, she stays in St. Louis and she gets the opportunity to write for the Daily Oklahoman to talk about her experiences. She starts learning from the people at St. Louis about being an activist and um, being an activist for progressive issues, things like juvenile delinquency, things like prison reform, things like child labor laws. All of these are progressive issues. By the time she comes back to Oklahoma, which is 1906, she is a full on progressive reformer. And she comes back and she starts working with miners. She starts working with farmers. She starts writing regularly for the Daily Oklahoman and tells people, you've got to donate money for this cause, for that cause. It's the right thing. If you're a good Christian, this is the right thing for you to do. She starts speaking in public, and people are drawn to her naturally, to her activism, to her passion. And it's okay for women to do this because she is speaking on causes that a woman should be passionate about, right? These are moral issues of the time, and women are um, in during the progressive era, women are seen as the moral leaders of society. And so when we talk about these issues, like prison reform and child labor and that sort of thing, this is what she's going to talk about over and over and over again. What ends up happening is the Democrats in Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory start paying attention to her, and they start seeing the kind of crowds she gathers. And when they start to pay attention to her, they realize, well, listen, this little lady is getting a lot of attention that we're not getting. What if we recruit her to be a part of our movement? And the Democrats get her to join their cause. Now, here's what you've got to remember: she's a woman and she cannot vote. She can vote for school elections, but she cannot vote in anything else because women are not allowed to vote in Oklahoma or Oklahoma Territory. So here she is. This is before the Constitutional Convention. They're trying to get delegates into the Constitutional Convention. And she is campaigning on behalf of the Democratic Party. She is doing so good for them. She is bringing in crowds bigger than anybody else. She is that popular. She's bringing in huge crowds. And so the Democrats say to her, listen, we like you so much. We'd like for you to come to the Constitutional Convention. We'd like for you to be a delegate. But you're just a delegate that's sitting there. You're not going to actually get a vote. She says, yeah, that's fine. They not only bring her to the Constitutional Convention, they ask her to speak. And she is, at the time, the only woman in the world allowed to speak at a constitutional convention. How's that? So here's a woman who is allowed to speak at a constitutional convention. And you would think that she would want to speak about something like women's suffrage, a woman's right to vote, because here's a woman talking about clearly what would be considered political issues. And clearly she's demonstrating her political um, vernacular and abilities, and she doesn't say a single word about political suffrage. Instead, what she talks about are her no, not political career yet. Instead, what she talks about are her issues. She what I'll call them her three planks. She has three primary issues, right? She talks about child labor, compulsory education, meaning required education for all young people under 16 and younger. And then her third is a government office for the needy. A government office for the needy. So her three issues are child labor laws, compulsory education for those who are 16 and younger, and a government office for the needy. These are her three issues she talks about. She gets 30 minutes to talk about it. It's such a huge, huge hit that she gets a standing ovation. They establish, the Constitutional Convention will establish what's called the Department of Charities and Corrections, the Oklahoma Department of Charities and Corrections. And they say to her, listen, we will open up that office for you to run it, but you're going to have to be elected to it. We can't appoint you to that office. You will have to run for that office. Now, think about this for a second. She cannot vote, but she can run for this office. She runs for office, and in running for office, she is elected with the highest number of votes in that election. She wins more votes than Charles Haskell does in running for governor. And she will be in that office for 2 terms. I mean, that's the thing. She runs and then wins re-election. She was allowed to run. They did not set term limits for her. So she could have run for more elections, but what stopped her was she started to come to the defense of Indian orphans who had been abandoned by white people who had tried to make claims to Indian lands. They found these orphans and abandoned them. They said, "Okay, we're going to make the claims to their lands," and these Indian children had been left behind. And Kate Bernard found these children and tried to fight for justice for these children. And when she tried to fight for justice on their behalf, immediately the state legislature said, absolutely not. You cannot do things like that. And then they eliminated her budget for her office, and essentially she couldn't do her work, not nearly as effectively. So she stopped. And it's a really tragic story because she did incredible work while she was there. Now, the other type of progressive were the socialists. So socialism in Oklahoma, which you'll know more about through agrarian socialism, is really quite significant. When we talk about socialists in Oklahoma, it's coming from farmers and workers in Oklahoma. Farmers and workers. And what's interesting here is that when we talk about these farmers and workers, these are people who are essentially wanting change in the most basic ways, right? These are people who want accountability in political ways, right? But they also want economic sustainability. And they're not getting it, right? One of their biggest frustrations is that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats have given them any answers, and neither of them have given them solutions to the existing problems. So they have had problems after problems after problems. These were ongoing, and Republicans and Democrats have never provided them the answers or solutions to what they have experienced, right? That's been their ongoing complaint. And so I want to present a couple of individuals who presented themselves as leaders in the socialist movement in Oklahoma in after statehood, or just before and then after statehood. The first one being Pete Hanratty. So Pete Hanratty is on the far right. In the black and white picture. Pete Hanratty would serve as the vice president of the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention. One of the things that you need to know about Hanratty So first of all, Hanratty was born. Um, or Pete Hanratty had moved to Oklahoma essentially as a young man. So when we talk about his life, the thing is he was someone who had already lived a life before he had moved here, right? So he was born in Scotland, and by the time he was 9 years old, he had already started working in coal mines. And that shouldn't be a surprise to you. For those of you who remember, you know, from your US history class, by the time they discover the value of coal and what coal could do, they started using child labor very early on. You would get children as young as the age of 5, 6 years old going into these coal mines because um, mines would get very small and they needed small bodies to go into these shafts and dig, right? And so these children would work very long hours in very dangerous conditions, right? So as young as the age of 9, he worked in coal mines in Scotland, and of course for extremely low wages, right? Then eventually he moved to the United States, and he was about 18 years old. And by the time he moved to the United States, he's a young man, right? And by then he has new ideas, and his new ideas are essentially based on the belief that workers need protection, and workers deserve uh, workers' rights. And he's primarily living and working in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio. And the problem by then, and this is, in the late 1880s, early 1890s, is he's trying to organize, he's trying to unionize, and he's trying to lead in those movements. And at that time period, trying to organize labor is a big no-no. Doing union movements and that sort of thing, absolutely not. And so that gets him blacklisted. Essentially, he's kicked out, and he's looking for a new place to live. The place that he finds to move to is Oklahoma, specifically Indian Territory. And the reason why he chooses Indian Territory is because Indian Territory, as I mentioned earlier, has the most dangerous coal mines uh, in North America. This is where you have explosions that kill, a minimum of 100 people. It's no joke to work in coal mines here. And so this is where he um, continues on his career of organizing. But not only that, instead of just focusing on being an organizer, he also decides to focus on politics, and uh, believes, and he actually does very well, believes that he would do much better creating a political career for himself. So he's in his early 40s by the time he gets into the Constitutional Convention. And listen, he is incredibly popular. He is incredibly popular to the point where there is a real conversation about him being the first governor of Oklahoma. There is real support behind him getting the Democratic nomination, and real talk of him getting support for it. In fact, Kate Bernard, who again cannot vote but has a lot of influence in the Democratic Party, Kate Bernard writes about this in her diary. She says, I was approached by Charles Haskell, and he said, "Hey, can you tell Pete Hanratty to back off? And can you tell people to throw their support behind me instead of Pete Hanratty? Because I think he's going to take a lot of votes and blah, blah, blah." And she says, "Okay, yeah, I will," because of the fact that Pete Hanratty is also someone who identifies as a democratic socialist. That's the thing. There is a fear or an argument, not a fear, but an argument that he might be too radical, too quote unquote radical. And therefore, Charles Haskell is more middle of the road and he might be more acceptable. And Kate Bernard does just that. She tells Pete Hanratty, hey, listen, maybe you should back off and let Haskell take this one. And Haskell takes it. But can I tell you, Bernard regrets it. She hates that she does it and totally regrets it. And you've got to wonder, what would it have been like had Hanratty taken the lead and won the nomination? What would it have been like had he been in charge? And what would the first few years have been like? Would he have moved Guthrie? I doubt it. But, would have businessmen have taken advantage of him? Who knows? Who knows? Okay. The second person pictured here is Oscar Ameringer. Oscar Ameringer is probably the most famous socialist identified with Oklahoma. Um, Oscar Ameringer moved to Oklahoma in 1907. He was born in Germany. He is actually credited for organizing um, the largest socialist movement in American history, and that socialist movement is right here in Oklahoma. Ameringer is a guy who is far more successful than Charles Haskell could ever hope to be when it comes to creating political alliances, when it comes to creating movements, when it comes to creating um, movements that last with a real legacy, right? This is a guy who's fighting for both farmers and sharecroppers, as well as fighting for the cause of civil rights. Ameringer was outraged by the issue of Jim Crow segregation. He was also outraged by the fact that you had sharecroppers who were near starvation. Ameringer writes quite beautifully about the encounters he had with people who were living in parts of Western Oklahoma who were near starvation. He had said that he had never seen the levels of extreme poverty in Western Oklahoma. He had never seen that kind of poverty in his life, and he couldn't understand why it was happening here. Um, Ameringer had run for office, but he is also someone who had campaigned, helped others campaign for office. He was someone who was just a great organizational type of person. And what's really interesting is he was not intimidated by other people's political identification, right? So he's not someone who would run away or hide from confrontation or conversation based on how you identified yourself politically. So, for example, when he died in the 1930s, um, the editor of the Daily Oklahoman, who was very, very politically conservative, wrote a very kind and moving obituary about Oscar Ameringer, and wrote about him and referred to him as a friend, and said some very moving things about him, and called him a true American. Um, Ameringer was someone who wrote extensively about the American experience, but also about the difficulties about living as an American, but as well as the hopes of being an American and that sort of thing. What's interesting here is, you have these um, aspirations that he has of becoming a politician and being elected to office and doing these great things in that sort of leadership capacity. And it doesn't work out the way that he hopes. Instead, his real success is in the connections that he makes. in the community building that he has. That's the great success. So the great stories of Oklahoma's early years are in the individuals, right? Whether you're talking about William H. Murray, or Oscar Maringer, or of course Kate Bernard, all of these individuals helped to create Oklahoma's early years and establish this early foundation.